want to begin by apologizing to the ASL interpreters for making you spell Wislawa Szymborska. And I'm going to say it again in just a little while. Get ready. What are you? I asked you 4 weeks ago. I was holding a soda bottle in my hand. Remember that? We were thinking about the percentage of cells in our bodies that are not human cells, 90%. We were thinking about the 90% of cells in our bodies that are bacteria, and how much our bodies depend on them in order to function. It was the first in this 3-part sermon series on body, mind, and soul. And while the phrase body, mind, and soul suggests that these are 3 distinct things, it turns out that not only are they interconnected, the body itself is not as distinct from other bodies or even from other organisms as we are accustomed to thinking. 2 weeks ago, we considered the mind. We reflected on new advances in science that are helping us understand the link between brain and mind, between the machinery of the body and the rich inner world of thought and memory. The complexity of human consciousness, of the mind, is one of the things that makes us unique. It's one of the things that makes us human, and I suggested at the end of that sermon, it must somehow be linked to soul. And so here we are, as promised, at soul. But of all the things that we imagine add up to make us human, the soul is surely the hardest to define or pin down. I've mentioned before that when I did an internship as a hospital chaplain and someone asked what my job was, I would often say it was to take care of the part of a person that's not made up of parts. The part that's not made up of parts. But if there's really a part of us that's not made up of parts, then so far, at least, it seems like it must be caused by parts, right? Like the mind that arises from the functioning of the brain. Could there be something else? Something that was pre-existing before we were born and will endure after? Or if it's temporary, is at least truly non-material? There's a lot of theological diversity in this congregation. It's one of the coolest things about us. And so I wonder, let's do a little informal poll. How many of you find the concept of soul to be relevant to your spirituality, your personal spirituality? And how many find that it does not resonate with you personally? You're in the minority. Now, regardless of whether you've raised your hand already, how many of you use the word soul from time to time without being quite sure what you mean by it? Maybe you've encountered a child or a baby who you felt had an old soul. And I'll bet there are a lot of people here who are just somewhere in between all of this, right? Yes, we have a lot of diversity. And we could go back and forth forever about what a soul is or isn't, whether one exists, and if so, what qualities it has. For this reason, the Buddha taught that it's wiser to avoid the subject. Sometimes avoidance is a valid spiritual practice. I bet you didn't think you were going to hear that in church today. Avoidance, it's not just for relationships anymore. Now you can add it to your spiritual repertoire. In Buddhism, the phrase used for soul is sometimes ego entity, as in the essential self. A soul is an ego entity. In Buddhism, it is said, with regard to the soul theory, there are 3 kinds of teachers in this world. The first teacher teaches the existence of an eternal ego entity that outlasts death. That teacher is the eternalist. The second teacher teaches a temporary ego entity which becomes annihilated at death. That teacher is the materialist. The third teacher teaches neither an eternal nor a temporary ego entity. That teacher is the Buddha. The risk, the Buddha knew, is that we'll become bogged down looking for proof of something unprovable, or ceaselessly debating it, wasting time that could have been spent mindfully in the present. wasting time that could have been spent cultivating awareness of the many truths that present themselves to us unambiguously. He encouraged people to avoid the pitfall of intellectual distraction and focus instead on our direct experience of reality and of truth. Of course, the Buddha himself was a Hindu, much as Jesus was Jewish, and he spoke from his location in that tradition. Hinduism contains a diversity of opinions about the soul. In Hinduism, Atman is the word we usually translate as soul, the eternal self. But the attributes of that eternal soul in Hinduism vary. Is the eternal self a servant of God or the same as God? Is the eternal self like a raindrop that merges back into the ocean at death? Or is it like a star that finds its place in the sky but remains distinct? It depends on who you ask. Hinduism, though it's ancient and rich with religious rituals, actually has some theological diversity in common with Unitarian Universalism. The Buddha intended to draw us past those questions. I also intend to draw us past those questions, more or less. Chicken, you are thinking. But while statements of belief about the soul are interesting, I'm more interested in the quality of human experience that gives rise to the notion in the first place. I'm less interested in statements of belief and more interested in the experience that gives rise to the notion of the soul. Whatever we think its technical aspects are, whether it exists forever or not, whether it's created by the mechanisms of the mind or by some other force, the concept of the soul, like all theological concepts, arises from lived experience. It reflects a part of human existence, a part of your existence, your personal existence, that is not adequately described by the language we've developed for body and mind. When you are in the presence of something very beautiful and you feel it in the core of your being, when you are loved deeply by someone and when you deeply love them, when you lose yourself in something, in a piece of music, or the view from Sandia Crest, or running or rolling down a long, easy road with the wind in your hair. When you come to church and you find yourself moved to tears without quite knowing why. When you experience a deep sense of peace, regardless of whatever is happening around you. When you write or say something very true and you aren't sure where it came from. Then you are experiencing what we have come to call the soul. We experience it when we spend time with children, too, or when we are making or appreciating art. The mind likes thoughts and ideas. The body likes touch and food. The soul likes love and imagination and art and creativity. Not just high culture art either. The soul responds to the paintings of Frida Kahlo and Fernando Botero and to the graffiti of Banksy. It responds to the beauty in the operatic voice of Denise Graves and to beauty in rap music. If you don't believe me about rap music, listen to Macklemore's song, Same Love. I'm going to include a link to it in the online printed version of this sermon. It'll make you cry. The soul responds to many things, but we aren't always in touch with it. Wislawa Szymborska gets at this in her poem. That was the reading this morning. We all have a soul at times. Joy and sorrow aren't two different feelings for it. It attends us only when the two are joined. We can count on it when we're sure of nothing and curious about everything, she writes. She makes the soul sound like a shy creature, almost like a ghost visible just in our peripheral vision. Another writer, Alvin Moore Jr., says, the soul is not known by the soul. Such a feat would be like hearing itself, or like sight seeing itself. This suggests that soul is more properly understood as a verb, that for a soul to know itself would be souling itself. And the process theologian Robert Mesley seems to get at this same idea when he says that the soul is not a thing. It's not an isolated stone hidden somewhere inside us, untouched by our experience, he writes. A soul is a dynamic process, a bundle of experiences, thoughts, emotions, dreams, and memories. In each moment of our life, we take in all of our past experiences, and we create ourselves out of them, deciding who we will be in that moment. When Mesley speaks of the bundle of experiences, thoughts, emotions, dreams, and memories, he seems to me to be overlapping a little bit back into that territory we called mind a couple of weeks ago. But he's right, I think, that soulfulness is tied to experience. Experience in this life, in this world, experiences that you have as you. For this reason, Thomas More speaks of the soul as being crass and earthbound. Crass and earthbound. That's totally the opposite of what we usually think of with the soul. But it makes sense when you think of the kinds of things that stir the soul. The mind can think itself right out of this world. When we encounter someone in that state, we say that they have their head in the clouds. But the soul is moved by this life. As we filter experiences, they're processed by the mind, but when they are soulful, they get at something deeper, a place beyond language. In the same way that a rainbow is not a thing, but a process of water droplets interacting with light, some suggest that the soul is stirred by experiences and is in a constant state of becoming. It's experiential. In this church, when we define religion, we often refer to the depth aspect of being, the part of your experience of living, of your life, that isn't visible on the outside. And nor is it just the noisy string of jingling thoughts that can link our days together. The depth aspect of being has to do with what moves you, with what fills you with courage or peace, with what comforts you when you're deeply troubled. Tending to the depth aspect of life is another way of saying caring for the soul. A good church is a place where we care for the soul. Some churches speak of saving souls. If I were to use that kind of language, I wouldn't mean what is usually meant by that. I don't think that when we die, our souls either go to heaven or to hell, and that I, by the power of this pulpit, can redirect your path. But I do know that there are some soul-crushing or soul-numbing things in this world. Tax forms. Don't get me started. But also unbounded consumerism, jobs or social structures in which humans are treated not as people but as mere means to an end. Senseless violence. There are some soul-crushing, soul-numbing things in this world. And I know that there are some soul-crushing, soul-numbing ways of walking in this world, behaviors we may adopt that make the soul want to run and hide, like being quick to anger or judgmental of others. Closing ourselves off to meaningful relationships out of fear or self-loathing or habit. Allowing ourselves to become disconnected from the natural world. And you don't have to drive or hike to the top of Sandia Crest or go camping in the Gila to be in touch with the natural world. Just looking up at the sky for a few minutes each day can do it. Another thing that's hard on the soul is when we treat it like another goal to conquer. We should be suspicious of spiritual programs that promise spiritual development, as though we could take the concerns and the values of modern culture, success, achievement, gain, and translate them into a spiritual set of instructions. Soulfulness is a process, a practice, not a destination. So if I were to speak about what is saving in this church, about what saves the soul here, it would be about being saved from a soulless or thoughtless or meaningless life. In contrast to trying to achieve perfection, caring for the soul begins with an acceptance of imperfection in ourselves and others, in our lives, and even in our churches. Sometimes I hear the well-meaning comment from someone that they like all of my sermons and that I never preach a dud. That's very flattering, but I mean it when I say, I promise I will preach one. I will preach a dud. I hope this isn't it. But it is going to happen, and not just once, but plenty of times, depending on how many chances I get. Nothing is created without risk. Likewise, what makes a church a soul-saving kind of place isn't a set of carefully perfected creeds, but it's an acceptance, an attitude of acceptance and honesty and love and blessing in our shared search for meaning. Thomas More writes that through the acceptance of human foibles, dignity and peace emerge. Dropping the fantasy of perfection frees us up to the possibility of self-knowledge and self-acceptance, which are the very foundation of soul. In this way, we are a very soulful church. Alvin Moore Jr. called the human being a provisional unity, body, mind, and soul, provisionally united. Maybe it isn't the unity of these things that's so provisional, so much as our sense that they are separate. We live in a state of paradox, a body, mind, and soul that are deeply interdependent and intertwined, if not one and the same, but at the same time the experience of them as different, distinct parts of our experience of being. The body must be functioning for the mind to work, and exercises of the mind, like meditation and the decisions we make around anger, clearly strengthen or diminish the soul. But the reverse order of cause and effect is also true. A soulless existence leads to depression and anxiety, which are also associated with physical symptoms, such as low energy, stomach distress, hypertension, heart problems. And so the three depend on each other to some extent. In her book, Divining the Body, Jan Phillips writes, "The spiritual path leads inward, for the beloved dwells there in every cell, like the oak in the acorn and the jewel in the mine. The great secret within us is waiting to be told through the living of our lives, waiting to be shared through the pleasure of our senses." She continues, "We need to climb back into our bodies and honor them as instruments of our souls. They are the means through which the divine takes shape in this world, crucibles in which the raging blaze of spirit is transformed into luminous thought, radiant creations, enlightened action. Through our bodies, we are continuing the creation of the universe, physically and metaphorically. It's not happening to us, but through us. And the meaning we are seeking, the deep joy and passion we are after, the enlightenment we long for, all of this arrives as we begin to repair what cultures and creeds have torn asunder," she says. Now, when I read her words about the body, I cannot think anymore of the body as separate from the mind and the soul. All that we are is an expression of being, of existence, of the universe. Remember David, the man I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, who was a collector and an observer of life? The one with collections of meteorites and plants, minerals, elements, pigments, and skulls. He was made of the same atoms as the universe that so fascinated him, and through him, I said, it was like the universe was observing itself. Likewise, our soulful experiences are experiences of the soulfulness of this world, of this universe, this thing called being, what you might call a divine soulfulness. This is what cultures and creeds have torn asunder, or at least neglected. The divinity of every soul, intellect, and body. Mine, yours, and everybody's. In Unitarian Universalism, it is the basis for one of our guiding principles, our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. And that, in turn, is the basis not only for personal healing, but for social justice, for healing the world. So whoever you are, and wherever you are in your spiritual path, may you have a deep sense of your divine nature in body, mind, and soul. May it be healing and grounding for you in all that is your life. And may we live in such a way as to nurture that wholeness in others. May it be so.